Segment 5, Why It Matters. About a year ago, you and I had lunch together, and you said a couple of things that I found so striking, I went back and made notes. And here's what you said. This is you speaking to me about a year ago. The other day, you said, I got a call from a friend who teaches at Berkeley. He'd been talking with a grad student about developments in physics during the Cold War, and the grad student said, the Cold War? What was that? And then you continued, Yuri, and said, Yuri, I was in my 20s when I joined the dissident movement, and you, me, were in your 20s when you entered the Reagan White House. That makes us members of the last cohort. We're the last ones who remember. How can we tell the story? Why does it matter? What harm would come to them if our children forgot all about it?
Well, I'll give you several reasons. One is very simple, the most straightforward, because communism still exists, and exists in very direct forms. There are still communist countries in this world, and the most apparent is North Korea, but Vietnam. But China also remains communist country with, let's not have illusions about that. So we do face, the Cold War is not completely over as long as we still have direct presence of communism. Now, it still is present in countries which are post-communist countries and which also spoils a lot of things in our foreign policy, like Russia. Russia is not communist country any longer, but the main communist structure, which is KGB, is still in power there, and it doesn't help us in our foreign policy in many aspects. But there is another thing which is very important. The communism was not simply part of Russian history. The communism gave us the best example and the most clear example of totalitarian society, in which idea of the big government was developed to its ultimate form, to its extreme. Also, during that time, the communism made us focus our minds to such extent that we understood so many important things about such totalitarian societies. Now, it's applicable to anything, including ourselves. And there are some trends into direction of big government, even in our country, as we can see, right? If we are not arrogant and snobbish enough to say that what happened in the Soviet Union relates only to Russians and have no possible implication to us, but if instead we become wise enough and start to learn, on the experience of Soviet communism, what those trends are, where can they bring us, etc., it would save us many possible errors even in our domestic policy. So what I'm saying, experience of communism is important in our foreign policy when we deal not only with communists but with many other totalitarian societies like Iran, for example. Mm-hmm. But lessons from communism would also be important to avoid many pitfalls and errors in our domestic policy.
Now, how far do you want to take that? Are you suggesting that the experience in the Soviet Union ought to suggest to us that national health care is a terrible mistake?
Absolutely.
You are?
Sure.
So what you're saying is be very careful of middle ground, be very careful of encroachments, of enlargements of government that by Soviet standards would look modest.
Right.
We always have to push in the direction of individual liberty, of individual freedom. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. What I am saying is that there are two extreme points which we should remember. There are, and I can juxtapose them, and I actually made a list for myself for big government society, which ultimate form is totalitarian society, and free society. And we can look in different areas of our life. What is starting point? We don't have absolutely free society. We always make some compromises. But the starting point for totalitarian society and free society are totally different. And we should always remember what our starting point, even in such most essential issue as freedom and security. Mm-hmm. Let's state these two fundamental things, which actually contradict each other. We realize it. whenever we involve more security, we sacrifice some part of freedom. And it's inevitable to some extent. We realize it. But we should still remember that in free society, we start with ultimate freedom,
Right.
and give away very small pieces of that freedom only whenever it's totally necessary to have more security. In totalitarian society, we start with the opposite end. Absolute security, zero freedom. And when the totalitarian government is pushed very hard, it may give very small piece of freedom, in exchange of... That's very important framework to me. And I think we can learn from communism a lot because it provides an ideal, pure case, of this big government.
Right.
Independent, whether it was Russia, what years it was. It gives us exact scientific model from which we can learn a lot.
Yuri, unfortunately, we're almost out of time. Students graduating from Cal Berkeley or MIT, you've worked at both institutions in this country, have no memory of the Cold War. They were born after Ronald Reagan left office. The Soviet Union went out of existence officially in December 1990. They have no memory at all. In one sentence, what do they need to know?
Well, they need to know fundamental principles of totalitarian society, and they need to know how Cold War was won by democratic world. And I believe it's our failure to some extent, but it's still recoverable, that they don't know. We were the last people who carry this torch, and we should make sure that it's passed to next generation. And there were too many forces, Peter, who didn't want and don't want it to happen. First of all, there was still strong forces of former communist governments, but it was also the left in democratic world, in this country, which didn't want to be seen on the wrong side of history. So all of them together said, let's forget about all of that. It's irrelevant any longer. We don't need it.
Here's my last question. How do you answer the following assertion? And I will now quote what Mikhail Gorbachev said when he visited Stanford University in 1990. The Cold War has been left behind, and it's not worth squabbling over who won.
Yes, because it's not in his interest. But why do we oblige him and said, look, Nazism ended 50 years earlier than communism. We still remember Nazism. It's a lot of books written, a lot of movies. Look, still now we have
and we all understand instinctively that that's a vital lesson, that students have to understand
Absolutely.
what Hitler did.
It's the same with communism.
All right. Yuri Yarim-Agaev, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.